Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Teddy. Thank you to my hosts here at Carleton and from the IDRC. It's a real honor to be asked to give the Michael Bell lecture, and in some ways it's an inappropriate act for me to accept. And the reason is this is an extremely accomplished diplomat. And what I'm going to say today is, first, I'm not a diplomat. Second, I will say some things that are not diplomatic. And third, some of the things I will say will really be about an issue for which I think diplomacy does not find an awful lot of purchase right now. There are other things going on. So I'm glad I see Linda Bell in the front row, and she's nodding. So I'm assured that I won't be offending the memory of Michael Bell. But diplomacy is about the art of the possible, right? And we use the term like realpolitik to mean sort of statecraft based on hard calculations of interest. But I'm going to be saying today that a lot of the diplomacy over the last 2 decades or so has been, we now can see a little bit more clearly, has been based on wishful thinking. And that wishful thinking is beginning to come to an end, and we're going to be now exploring some of the consequences of that. So this morning what I'm going to be doing is, I can't quite see today. Yes. That's the outline of the talk. Okay, yeah. I'm going to be first talking about this sort of unspeakable truth. What is the reality of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that people have been scared to speak about. Then I'll go back and look a little bit about the peace process. There was such a thing called a peace process. I think it was real. I think it had possibilities. But I'll be talking about what it was and why I think it died and why it was difficult to recognize or to acknowledge the death of the peace process. Then I'll talk about what's left after the death of the peace process. And then what to watch for in terms of developments. And if I'm lucky, I will have exhausted my time and won't have to get to the last item on the agenda. That's what to do about it, because there I'm going to be a little bit at sea, but I will try to be constructive. That'll be the hardest part of the talk. So let me begin with what I'm calling the unspeakable truth. And I'm going to here with joke about the chair of a classics department in a university that's facing real budget problems, and the dean comes to the chair of the classics department and says, "I'm sorry, we're going to have to cut the classics department. You're teaching dead languages." And the chair of the classics department responds by saying, "Well, yes, of course, we know that Latin and Greek are dead languages, but who told you?" And in a sense, I had a similar kind of experience. I started I'm not a diplomat, I'm an analyst, an academic, and I write for a think tank, the Carnegie Endowment, but I began to write things about 15 years ago calling Sunset for the Two-State Solution, Receding Dream of Statehood, and this sort of thing. And anytime I would talk to people who were deeply involved in conflict, Palestinians and Israelis, sometimes sort of working level people, their reaction would be, "Well, yeah, of course, but who told you?" Or do I get to have a PhD for saying things like that? For speaking obvious realities? But when I would speak in policy circles, the reaction would be very different. What's your agenda? What are you really trying to say? Whose side are you really on when you're making these kinds of statements? And that is actually now beginning to change. I think the sort of sense that that the peace process as we have known it has come to an end, and that there is not necessarily ground underneath those diplomatic efforts, I think is beginning to sink in. A sort of a scratch beneath the surface has revealed this. For a long time, diplomats would routinely issue statements saying things like, and I'm not making this up, this was repeated in some diplomatic statements, "The situation continues to be unsustainable." Or you would have analysts saying, it's 5 minutes to midnight for the two-state solution. And I started hearing that about 15 years ago. And according to my watch, that means it's now 15 years after midnight. Those are the sorts of warning talks that people would give. And at this point, the warnings, I think, have come true. And the new vocabulary is emerging. that is now entering regular circles, that is extremely harsh. In words like settler colonialism and apartheid are now entering policy discussions in a way where they were sort of kept out before, and that's jarring for people who follow this conflict for a long time. So let me go back and talk first about what I'm calling the peace process. What was peace? What was process? Why did it fail? And why pretend that it hasn't failed? What was peace was, in a sense, fairly clear for the last quarter or so of the 20th century. In 1973, there was an Arab-Israeli war, following which there was a peace conference or a meeting in Geneva, and that's when you begin to hear things like peace conference, peace process, and so on. And the peace that was the people were talking about then was a peace between Israel and the Arab states. And there was sort of a set of initiatives and conferences and mechanisms and so on. In 1991, there was the Madrid Peace Conference. And again, that focused for the most part on peace between states. There was an Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty in 1979. There was an Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty, 1994. But what was left out of that concept of peace was, of course, Palestinians, because they did not have a recognized state. They had a movement, the Palestine Liberation Organization, that was recognized as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people by the Arab League and increasingly internationally accepted as interlocutors. But Israel would not essentially engage the Palestinian national movement. They would engage Arab states, but essentially regarded the Palestinians as people who had to be dealt with through Arab states. And so that was a peace process, or that was a peace part. And then in the 1990s, essentially an Israeli leadership and a Palestinian leadership said, we will deal with each other. And that's the essence of part of the Oslo Accords. Israel will accept that the Palestinian Liberation Organization is a representative of the Palestinian people, and we will sit down and we will talk with them. And the PLO essentially recognized that we will deal with Israel. While we are trying to come up with some kind of negotiated solution, we will have a process of allowing Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza to administer more of their affairs on an interim basis while we negotiate a final status agreement. What that final status agreement was an outline. Here are the topics we've got to address, but no real clue as to the content. And that's where I get to the process part of it, because part of the argument was that if you could get a diplomatic process going, that if you could get the two sides actually beginning to talk practicalities, build trust, understand what their red lines were, what they wanted, and so on, and you could engender this process, and you get leaderships invested in this, in being able to show some signs of success. The process itself would perhaps make what was unimaginable today possible tomorrow, in terms of concessions, in terms of reconciliation, in terms of the content of an agreement. So some of these really difficult issues, which could not be addressed in theory off the bat, manageable solutions would be able to present themselves. And something of the sort actually happened in the 1990s. That is to say, you had Israeli and Palestinian leaders who had sort of negotiating processes. They began to talk about some of these issues. As I said, they came up with a sort of detailed outline of the sorts of things that they would have to agree on. But from the beginning, there were flaws, and those flaws, eventually became fatal. Number one, there wasn't really any sense of what the end was. I mean, different parties had ideas about where this would lead. But there is sort of a mantra of the international diplomatic community now that began probably in the early 2000s. The solution is known as a two-state solution, and so on. You go back to the 1990s, and if people knew there was a two-state solution, they didn't say so. When Hillary Clinton used the phrase Palestinian state in 1998, the White House issued a statement saying she does not speak for the White House. She just lives here. They didn't say the last part, but she was first lady at the time. And essentially the phrase Palestinian state was unspeakable by American leaders who were overseeing the peace process, by Israeli leaders. So if they knew that that was coming, it was a well-guarded secret, primarily from their own publics, but also kind of the sense that, wait, whatever kind of concession, that's a reward, that should be the last stage. So that rather than spelling out the kinds of concessions or the kinds of endpoint that they wanted, you had a peace process that had no defined end. And by the time people started finally spelling out on the American side, on the Israeli side, what that looked like, it was, I think, in a sense, too late. The second problem was it depended on leaders who were weak, operating in political systems in which vetoes were widely distributed. It was easy for the opponents of this to throw a monkey wrench into it. Most obviously and violently with the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, but certainly with bombing campaigns by Hamas and so on. So it became essentially, if you were opposed to the process, you had easy places that you could identify where you could interfere with it. And so rather than building up a trust, some of the process generated opposition and mistrust on both sides. A further problem, I think, was these two aspects that I'm talking about: peace between Israel and between Israel and Arab states, and peace between Israel and the Palestinian national movement, became disconnected from each other. So that Jordan, as I said, signed a peace treaty. Egypt already had. There were serious Israeli-Syrian negotiations that ultimately failed. But essentially, that took an awful lot of the pressure off the Israeli leadership. And so the idea that there was an Arab-Israeli peace process really sort of disintegrated, and it was really an Israeli-Palestinian peace process. And again, the fundamental problem was, or one of the fundamental problems was, the status quo was essentially manageable and acceptable for Israelis. They were in no hurry to solve this, and it was not for Palestinians. And there was a tremendous power imbalance. So you take two parties in the room and pretend that they're kind of equal parties, and they're not. And the process did not lead to an agreement. So, but what actually happened was that the process continued even as peace got away. And so you could have new diplomatic initiatives. There was Camp David, there was there was Annapolis, and so on. You would have these processes continuing as the ground was disintegrating from the process. So why continue? Why pretend that there is a viable peace process when it is becoming increasingly clear, as I say, that that it's maybe years after midnight? And I think there were good reasons. One reason was it essentially legitimated the spoilers. You were basically going to say the opposition has won. The Israeli right, the Hamas, they have won. A second was that there was a sense that an awful lot had been achieved. There was an incredible amount of effort that had been given to spelling out what a settlement would look like, and just to sort of rip that up and start over again would be unthinkable. And so people didn't want to think about it. But but something else was, and this was the question I would get all the time. It's like, okay, yes, of course you're right. So what's your alternative? So what are you going to do? And I never had a good answer to that. You'll hear my answer today, and you can decide for yourself whether it's a good one. But I've had plenty of time to think about it. But the consequences of openly acknowledging that this was a conflict that had become intractable or not susceptible to diplomatic solutions was just, I think, too terrible to contemplate. And so diplomacy had become the art of the impossible. And that was clear, I think, Probably by, I mean, to me, I concluded this probably about 2007, 2008, 2009. And as I say, the kind of the realization, I think, has crept up. So what does that mean that's left? If when we start talking about the situation in Israel-Palestine, and start talking not what there should be, what the solution would look like, what the peace process is, if we cancel all that talk and just say, what's there on the ground right now? What are we left with? And then you'll begin to see, when I go into this, I think you'll begin to see why it is that people don't like to, a lot of people don't like to think about it. What there is right now is a one-state reality. There is one state in this territory, and it's called Israel, and it controls entry and exit. It controls security. It controls things economically. It controls an awful lot of what happens internationally, what happens internally. If you take it that way and understand kind of how is it that people are living, you come up with some really hard terms. And I'm going to talk about two of them, apartheid and empire, and then talk a little bit more about kind of lived realities. Right? If there is one state, is this an apartheid reality? This is a question that's been put itself on the analytical table. And when I first heard the term apartheid being used to the situation, it was probably in the early 1980s. And it was a time of an international movement against apartheid. And I took it to be essentially a symbolic condemnation. And it had the expected effect. It would rally opponents who said essentially this situation is untenable. It may be opposition to Zionism, to the state of Israel. And it got people who supported Zionism in the state of Israel very angry. So it was a term that was primarily significant for its emotional value. But it's also a term that has some legal meaning, right? There's an international legal apparatus that grew up out of the international struggle against apartheid, that said, this is what apartheid is. And does Israel qualify? And increasingly, you have people with strong legal backgrounds saying it's beginning to check an awful lot of boxes. This is not insignificant. It is not insignificant because what I think it will mean is that future generations of Israel, well, I shouldn't look too far into the future, but the current generation of Israeli leaders will have to deal with the fact that some governments will begin to start looking at it through this lens. And maybe some court systems. And again, because there is an international legal apparatus. So this is a real legal headache for the state of Israel. But I want to talk about it on an analytical level. Does it make sense to use the term apartheid? It's a term I resisted for a long time. Like I said, I thought this is not an analytical term. And I'm increasingly thinking it kind of is and kind of isn't. So here is the situation, the argument that I would use, is that apartheid as a term was introduced internationally with if there are people here who know their South African history better than I do, they're welcome to correct me in the discussion. But essentially when the National Party came to power in 1948 and adopted as an explicit ideology and a program, we are going to take South Africa and build these kinds of systems, separate representation systems, ultimately the homelands and so forth and so on. But they came into a system, and Israel hasn't done that. But what happened in South Africa in 1948 was not completely out of the blue. It was already a very heavily racialized system in which who you were determined your level of rights and privileges within the society. And when you look at this situation of Israel-Palestine, and if you say, hey, there's one state there, what kind of rights and privileges do I have? Well, it matters. If you're Palestinian, if you're Israeli, if you have an Israeli ID card, if you have a Jerusalem ID card, but you're Palestinian, but so if you have a Palestinian ID card, but not a Jerusalem ID card, and so on, and then there's all these gradations, and it begins to look a little bit like this. So the lived reality for people who are actually operating on a daily basis begins to take on that kind of coloration. So it's not a term that I think we can analytically dismiss anymore. Second term, empire. The reason I put it up there is, political scientists. I am a political scientist, not a great one, but I try. They're great with definitions, right? So, what is a democracy? You could get political scientists saying, okay, here's the minimum conditions, here's gradations of democracy, and so on. But we know kind of what a democracy is, and what a democracy isn't. Empire, there's not a good definition for, and there's a reason for that. Is because what an empire is historically is a political system that's usually built on sort of ad hoc arrangements, which means that there's some kind of core leadership. And it might be an individual, it might be a group or something like that, that has political control over a population that it's not really accountable to. So when we think about empire, we think big, Roman Empire, British Empire. This is a small empire, but essentially it has some aspects of that. In that, you have an Israeli state accountable to some of the people who are there, but not to all of them. And it controls the lives in some fairly detailed ways of inhabitants that it is just not accountable to in any meaningful way. So when we start talking about what exactly existing on the ground, we begin to use big words like apartheid and empire. What I want to do now is to go on and say, okay, let's leave the big words behind. Is this imperial? Is this apartheid? Say, what is going on, actually? One is, here I've just got some observations. When Israel is increasingly the reference point, right? So for Palestinians, for a long time, the Palestinian national movement was about getting Israel out of their lives, okay? Ending the occupation, doing things the Palestinian way. And when Palestinians talk right now, even Hamas, what are you doing? What is your program? Very often Israel comes up in the answer. Israel is increasingly the orientation. We want to make Israel do this. We want these kinds of rights. We want them, this sort of thing. So Israel, the state of Israel, is increasingly not accepted as just by Palestinians, but accepted as inevitable. Second, let's say there's no longer two national movements. There is a Palestinian national movement. But the idea that what you have are two national movements, a Palestinian national movement and an Israeli national movement, that are sitting down and trying to negotiate things, I don't think that's really telling you what is going on. You have a state of Israel that controls a diverse population, has different relationships with different parts of that population, more than you have two national communities kind of dealing directly with each other. Third, what I'm calling the receding dream of statehood. As I mentioned earlier, this was a conclusion I came to about a dozen years ago. Or most of the 20th century, with the emergence of the Palestinian national movement, it was about securing a Palestinian state. What kind of Palestinian state, what its borders would be, those were things that people debated. But the idea was that there needed to be a political entity called Palestine that took its place on the world map along with other political entities. And that the job, for instance, of the Palestine Liberation Organization was to represent Palestinians in a state-like manner, and essentially the PLO would deliver a state over to a state of Palestine. State of Palestine was declared many times. Actually, the first declaration had very little effect. It was in Gaza in 1948. There's a Declaration of Independence, and an all-Palestine government is set up. So there's a second Declaration of Independence in Algiers in 1988. And there's other kinds of steps that the Palestinian leadership has taken to say this is about statehood. I don't think that's what Palestinian national movement is about anymore. It's not about putting Palestine on the world map. It's about finding some way in which Palestinian national aspirations and Palestinian peoplehood can be met on a national level, but also Palestinian rights, individual rights, can be realized. And is kind of agnostic about framework. Is this in one state? Is this in two states? Is this in like confederation, a federation? Sure. If you ask Palestinians, and pollsters do ask them, are you for a one-state option or a two-state option, or this sort of thing, a binational state, you will get an answer. People will answer, but I think the answers have very little salience. Some of the most interesting discussions I like to say that I hear are when I hear not Palestinians answer my questions, but when I hear Palestinians arguing with each other. And I don't hear them arguing that much about this anymore. They argue about tactics. They argue about strategy. They complain we have no national strategy. But they don't argue about one state or two states that much. They do a little, but not very much. And by the way, some of this is generational in nature, and I'll come back to it. You have a situation of embedded inequalities. As I say, it's like if you were to take an inhabitant of this territory and say, can you use this airport? Can you use this road? Can you own this land? Can you vote? This sort of thing. You'd have to ask the question, who are you? What kind of status do you have? And they're very different for different kinds of people. And next thing is illegitimate but inevitable. For an awful lot of Palestinians, this is not a just situation. This is not a tolerable situation. Except they have to tolerate it. It's just there. If you were to ask Palestinians, would you like there to be a Palestinian state? Well, yes, that would be great. If you were to ask me, would you like to be able to fly? I would say yes. There's this problem called gravity. Solve that for me and then call me and ask me the question again. And so there's just something very deeply. The Israeli occupation has lasted since 1967. Okay? That means it's a different situation is beyond the historical memory of most living Palestinians. So it's just there. And finally, my last observation is that the situation is not critical. It's corrosive. There are all kinds of ways in which it can get worse. But this statement that I kept on, that I said diplomats would use, sometimes European diplomats, sometimes a quartet, which was a coalition of international actors, would use, the situation continues to be unsustainable, I think actually gets it exactly right. It's a horrible situation, it should be unsustainable, and it continues. And it's going to continue. And it's going to go on and on and on. It can change. It can change for the better, can change for the worse, within kind of the basic parameters of the one-state reality. So it's not as if there will be periodic flare-ups of violence, like there was a little over a year ago. Periodic flare-ups of violence that are sometimes pretty horrifying in nature, but not ones that fundamentally challenge the situation. At the end of each episode of violence, there's a rejiggering of the rules. What can you get in and out of Gaza? What are relations like in Israeli neighborhoods and this sort of thing? So they're not irrelevant, but they don't fundamentally alter the situation. So that's what we're left with, or that's what people who live there are left with. So this is a situation that, as I'm suggesting, will change, is dynamic, but you should keep your eye on evolutionary change rather than revolutionary change, at least for now. So what kind of evolutionary change should we be watching for? And here I would say there are, I'm talking about 6 possible developments, or 6 developments to keep an eye on. One, Palestinian political decay at the top. The Palestine Liberation Organization, which I said was founded in 1965, it became really kind of, there was a sea change in the way that it represented Palestinians in 1969. There was a Palestinian Authority created as part of this peace process. 1994, which began to administer affairs of Palestinians in West Bank and Gaza. And so there's this sort of structure of Palestinian leadership institutions. Palestine Liberation Organization, Palestinian Authority, the State of Palestine that's been declared. There are Palestinian diplomatic delegations. There's a Palestinian Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, and so on. And there's a Palestinian court system in the West Bank and Gaza. Theoretically, the same court system, but it's divided in half because Gaza and the West Bank are governed differently. And those institutions are beginning to decay. Very seriously. They're not decaying in the sense that schools are closing. They're decaying in the sense that the top leadership no longer has a viable strategy or option to present to their own people. So they simply are tuned out as irrelevant. So what you have are some Palestinian administrative practices and bodies that make sure that, kids go to school, that make sure that diplomas get issued, and that sort of thing, that make sure that trash gets picked up, and those are continuing, but they're disconnected. Essentially, there's these administrative institutions, they're disconnected from any political leadership, and that's actually pretty serious right now. And it's been going on for about 15 years or so. The Palestinian political decay, I think, is something to keep an eye on, especially as the current generation of Palestinian leaders gets called to a higher cause. Linkages at the bottom. What I mean here is there still are some Palestinian movements. Palestinians call them factions. Fatah, the Palestinian National Movement, and Hamas, the Movement of Islamic Resistance. There are other factions as well. Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and so forth and so on. Most of those others are basically irrelevant. They've decayed. But Fatah and Hamas are still there as movements, and they still have some vitality at the local level. And when outsiders tend to look at them, they tend to kind of look at, okay, who's going to be on the Fatah Revolutionary Council, this top leadership group? Who's controlling this group? To me, the really interesting developments is how much they're able still to have some organizational presence in Palestinian society on the local level. Are they going to go the same way as the political leadership at the top, or are they going to actually continue some viability at the bottom? Are there any other alternative movements that are arising? And we've seen some signs of that, some attempts to start new Palestinian political movements or even social movements on the ground. Usually what happens is one catches on, captures the imagination of some Palestinians, at least on a local level, sometimes on a national level, but recedes fairly quickly. None have had any organizational staying power so far, but that's something important to watch. Generational trends, what I say is when I sit with younger Palestinians, and I have to confess here, the younger Palestinians I've sat with, it's now been 3 or 4 years since I've sat with them, so they're older now, because I haven't been able to get there. But they've grown up in a very, very different situation and there was one fascinating discussion I once saw between a group of Palestinians, so some younger and some older. And the older generation were people who'd basically kind of lived through this peace process. And they recognized that it had failed, but they said, look, we had some real accomplishments. We got recognized internationally, right? We have diplomatic relations. We have a lot of state-like functions. And no, it didn't. We weren't able to deliver on the final promise. And the younger Palestinians in the room were saying, yeah, worthless. And it was actually kind of like heart-wrenching to see, because they basically were talking past each other. Every single thing that we sacrificed our lives for, you're saying is worthless? I'm translating. And the answer was yes. It was not relevant to our lives. And so looking to see what is capturing the imagination of younger Palestinian generations, I think it's something to keep an eye on. Internationalization is something else. So, and this is something that is, to me, really interesting intellectually, But it also is sometimes unpleasant to watch because it leads to kind of nasty political exchanges. But if you go back to the 1960s or 1970s, if you were to say, so who's speaking for the Palestinians? If you were to like turn on a television, say there's a Palestinian spokesperson, it was very often somebody who was from the PLO, maybe a diaspora intellectual who was close ties to these leadership structures and so on. It's a Palestinian official with some kind of official status. What is happening now is an awful lot of the dynamism are for the Palestinian cause are things like the International Solidarity Movement or the BDS movement. Right? This is happening at a popular level, and it's happening around states rather than through states. And it leads to a kind of gritty kind of politics that means essentially it's not just, who you see when you watch TV. It's kind of what arguments, I don't know what the situation is at Carleton, but when I'm at George Washington University, it means what arguments I overhear among the students when I'm walking across campus, and they're usually not polite. But so there's this sense in which Palestinians, and if you talk to younger Palestinians, they're acutely aware of this, especially the ones who are more, I would say, more cosmopolitan or globally oriented. It's like what we need to do is to essentially globalize our movement on a popular level. And are they going to be successful? They had some successes in, I think, making the BDS movement something that is now recognizable in among many people outside of Palestine. Finally, thing I say, two more things. One is Ramla, not just Ramallah. Ramallah is essentially the capital of this Palestinian Authority. And it's where an awful lot of intellectuals are. It bears at universities outside Ramallah. It is where a lot of the Palestinian leadership is. And it's where, you ask a question, what do Palestinians think about X? Temptation is to go to Ramallah for good reason, and that shouldn't stop. Ramla is a mixed Israeli city. So the people who live in Ramla are all, well, they're not all Israelis. Most of them, there are Palestinians and there are Jews that live in Ramla. In May of last year, when there was fighting, or I would say disturbances that began in Jerusalem, spread to fighting essentially between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, one thing that happened was that this became reflected in communal tensions between Israeli Palestinians and Israeli Jews in mixed cities. And when I would read about this, I didn't go to visit. My reaction was, as an American, and I'll reveal my age, who grew up, I was born in 1958, so some of my earliest political memories are of American racial tensions in urban areas in the late 1960s. And this sounded so similar. It's like we thought we knew who these people were, and we find out, we have got good relations with them, and then these outside agitators come in. And this is a kind of politics, a really visceral, you can't trust your neighbor if they're on the other side is going on within Israeli society. And it's ugly and it's unpleasant, but I think it's real. And some of the effects, I think, may be essentially to take the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that was thought of as between the state of Israel and Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and make it a conflict within Israeli society, even among Israeli citizens. And there are new movements arising among Israeli Palestinians, some of which are essentially saying we want into the political system. Some are saying we don't want to have anything to do with the political system. Those are debates and connections between them. Here's a very interesting fact. In 1948, when the State of Israel was created, among Palestinians, there was a Muslim Brotherhood movement just beginning to form. Okay, State of Israel is there. So what happens to it? Well, the Muslim Brotherhood that was forming among Palestinians found themselves under three different regimes. In Gaza, under an Egyptian regime which cracked down on the Brotherhood, so they kind of survived but underground. Jordan, the West Bank was administered by Jordan until 1967, so the Muslim Brotherhood there basically kind of amalgamated to the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan. What about the Israeli movement? Well, they kind of stayed underground. And then they kind of reemerged as the Islamic movement in Israel. And then they split. And one part of that movement is basically emphasizing socially conservative forces, and they were supporting the Israeli government that's just about to leave office. They are historically, organizationally linked to Hamas. Hamas went one way, they went the other. They essentially joined the Israeli government, and Hamas did not receive an invitation and probably would not accept it. But these are the sorts of linkages that I think are actually being revived in ways that will be sorted out over the next generation. The final thing to watch for, I say, is what I call a 1948 moment. When I use the phrase 1948 moment, I'm not talking about 1948, which was the end of the British Mandate, the Declaration of the State of Israel, beginning of the Palestinian refugee problem, and so on. No, it's a 1948 movement in South Africa, when you had the National Party come to power. And that's what I think the Israeli far right represents. Saying, let's make this official. Yes, Palestinians can stay in the state of Israel as long as they're loyal to the state. This is a Jewish state, remember that. And so it has to do with perhaps formally annexing the West Bank. It has to do with upsurge in settlement construction in the West Bank, and it has to do with relations within or among Israeli citizens, if they're Jewish or if they're Palestinians. And I don't think that they will get their way. They are a minority, but they will be likely very represented in the incoming Israeli cabinet in some very significant positions. And they've got a project in mind, and I don't think they'll be able to push this formal declaration, what I'm calling a 1948 moment, but I think they will have some impact on policy in all kinds of subtle ways. And so those are things to watch. Okay, what to do about it? And I think I succeeded in leaving myself little time for this. Here, let me just talk about a few phrases that I hear from people who are sort of invested in this diplomatically, who say, okay, yes, you're right, so what do we do? Two phrases they use sometimes are protection. Okay, we cannot impose a settlement, and there's not going to be a settlement anytime soon, but we can make sure that some basic minimal rights are protected for the people who are involved. So the term protection comes up. Resilience also comes up. That what we can do, I've talked about sort of the decay on the Palestinian side, especially the political leadership, so we can make sure that Palestinian society is not sort of atomized into a collection of individuals, but you still have some resilient Palestinian institutions on a social level, an economic level, on a political level. Those sound like good ideas to me. When I said bringing law and politics back together, well, the peace process that I described wasn't explicitly based on this, but at least, especially under American leadership, it was implicitly based on the idea, like I say, that you got to get these two parties talking directly to each other. And the more you bring in outside legal structures, United Nations, International Criminal Court, you're messing up negotiations. And in a sense, you were messing up negotiations. But the other effect of what was happening was essentially to say, okay, this is a law-free zone. And that, I think, had very pernicious effects on outcomes. It made it impossible to address the power imbalance, which I mentioned earlier. I say another thing to do: embrace broader publics. The peace process that I described did work in the 1990s among specific groups of leaders who really got very deeply invested in this. The older generation of people that I described in this room, this debate among Palestinians, some of them had been peace processors. They had been involved in negotiating some of these things. And they understood, they had friends on the Israeli side. And it became very easy, essentially, to say, okay, these are the people, getting this group together and getting some understanding about them and then getting them to sell it to their own publics, that's going to be the secret of the solution. But as a result, very important constituencies were left out. Islamists on the Palestinian side, settlers on the Israeli side. I would say the Israeli right, for the most part. I don't know if it would have been possible to have a peace process that encompassed these forces in the 1990s. But now that the peace process is dead, I said I was undiplomatic. Now that it's dead, there's no reason not, I think, to try and think of this as a issue area that involves multiple constituencies, all of whom have voices that will affect developments and therefore have to be incorporated. I'm talking about suggestion, preserving political options. Palestinians will sometimes say, well, let's just dissolve the Palestinian Authority. They're irrelevant. I think there are still on the Palestinian side these leadership structures that are very weak and very decayed. They're the Palestinian Authority, which doesn't really actually call itself so much the Palestinian Authority anymore. They call themselves the State of Palestine. They prefer that title. The Palestine Liberation Organization. And these are things that don't have an awful lot of vitality. I think abolishing them on the Palestinian side would be a mistake. Because it would leave essentially the state of Israel and individual Palestinians with nobody able to talk collectively for them. So I'm not sure there's going to be, well, I'm pretty sure there's not going to be a viable diplomatic process anytime soon. But preserving those the options of political leadership, I think would be important, especially for Palestinians. And I say for when the diplomats return. I don't know where this is going. I think most of the developments that have occurred over the last 10 to 20 years or so have been very corrosive, not simply to a diplomatic solution, but even to many people's lives. And the costs are distributed unequally. And for most Israeli Jews, the situation, there are all kinds of unpleasant aspects of the current situation, but it's essentially tolerable. And that's not so much true for Palestinians. A situation like that, I beg to disagree with EU diplomats who say that it's unsustainable. It is sustainable for a while. At some point, I think the generation that I'm talking about will be living in a different kind of society. And there may be a time for diplomats to come back and say, how are we going to manage this? I think leaving the population of this region entirely to their own devices is going to lead to an intractable internal conflict of the kind that usually have bad international implications. So expecting it to just sort of fester internally is unrealistic, indefinitely is unrealistic. But I think the question diplomats and international actors should be asking themselves right now is not how do we solve the conflict tomorrow? How do we get back to Camp David or this place or that place, or how do we revive this negotiating framework? But how do we preserve political options so that when future generations take up this file again and talk in terms of a peaceful resolution of this conflict, there'll be some ingredients to deal with. And any step that is taken in that direction will be positive, even if the benefits aren't reaped for another generation. Thank you.